Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Michael Zuber, one rental at a time. It is Monday, and that means we speak to the one and only Mr. Greg Dickerson. How you doing, sir?
Doing great, Michael. Good to see you.
Nice to see you as well. I have to say, your calls, folks, and if you haven't been watching Greg's playlist, you're really missing out. He has made some amazing calls. And what we're going to tap into here in video one is a little bit of his history and experience. He was a builder in oceanfront properties, and during the last real estate recession. So I wanted to talk about surviving a bear market. How do you do that? What do you decide to do? And then how do you thrive after? Because I think it's about surviving and then thriving, but let's hear from you.
Yeah. So it wasn't just that. I was doing commercial projects and land development projects. I had a bunch of stuff going on back in 2008 and 9. And, it was a very difficult time where, banks would all of a sudden call your loan, even if you weren't in default. The banks were failing, especially one of the banks. What was it? SunTrust. SunTrust was just caving in on everybody. They were doing a lot of development loans.
Mm-hmm.
So, you had to understand what the banks were dealing with, what they were going through, and how to best negotiate and position yourself with them. And as a developer, generally you could do projects, pull all your equity out. So at the end of the day, they were non-recourse. All the loans were non-recourse. You had no equity in them because you got paid through developer fees or general contracting fees, to build the properties. So the banks had all the risk. So, you could negotiate from a point of strength, but just in general, as the market turned and shifted, it became a very different market. And, inventory started stacking up, properties weren't selling, values were getting cut in half in a lot of markets. As a builder, I was flat out put out of business. There was just no work. Nobody was spending money to build in a declining market or to improve or renovate properties in a declining market. It was just, really, really tough times. So I pivoted because, there were still properties that were getting bought and things like that. So I just pivoted my business model. Instead of doing the big multi-million-dollar high-end homes, I started focusing on the affordable price point homes that people were paying cash for. So what I did was, I kind of led the market down and you started looking for lots, because lots were the slowest moving segment of the market. And I started building, little beach houses that cost less than the kitchens in these multi-million-dollar houses, that I was building before. But there was still a market for that $95,000 to $350,000 house, depending on where it was located in the market. Now, this was 2008, 2009, and those values didn't change for a long time. So I was able to build a nice, sustainable business off of this and pivot into building, 15 to 20, sometimes 30 of these a year, versus doing a couple of, I was doing 30 of the big $1 million houses a year, but I ended up making just as much money on these as I did some of the bigger houses, because there was so much demand for them and I was getting the lots so cheap. And that's where I tell the story where I ended up buying lots for about half of what I offered people pre 2008 and 9.
Oh, wow.
And, and even back in 04, 05. So a lot of people I talked to in 04, 05, when the market was kind of peaking, I said, look, the market's changing, good time to sell. They said, it'll be worth 10 times as much in, whatever, twice as much in 10 years. And it ended up being worth half as much in 10 years, in less than 10 years. Cause, it was 2009, late 2009, going to 2010, 11, when I was buying a lot of those lots. I'd talked to people 3 or 4 or 5 years before for about half the price. And it wasn't me, it was the market. So as I bought a lot, let's say a lot was once worth 100,000, now it's worth 50. So I'd buy one at 50 and I was watching the market, drop. My next offer would be 40 and my next offer would be 30. And then it got all the way back down to about $25,000, which is where lots were selling for when I first moved to the area in 1997. You could buy lots for 5, 10, 15,000, and then it got up to about 20, 25, and it reverted all the way back to those values again. So I just kind of watched the market, led the way down in that regard, and just, started building these little, production beach houses, 3-bedroom, 2-bath. People were coming down, paying cash for them, second homes, year-round homes. So, whole different business model. So you just got to kind of reinvent yourself and, wait for things to turn.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I want to kind of highlight. First and foremost, the speed at which the market turned, right, from red hot to off was something to watch. It seemed overnight, and maybe it was a 30 or 45 day window, but when it turned pretty quick, right?
Yeah, and the main reason was because the banks were in trouble. So the
Yes.
liquidity dried up. The banks were not lending. The Fed did not come in and backstop that. They let it all crash. I mean, it's really interesting to see what's going on now, what happened in, March of 2020, what happened, after 2009 and 10. The Fed started quantitative easing, but they weren't buying mortgage-backed securities. They weren't propping up the banks. So it was a very interesting time, but that was the main thing. I mean, interest rates went up over 5% and the banks stopped lending money. So, the general population could not borrow any money.
Yeah.
Most people were in default or going into default, very quick, not overnight, but that started happening afterwards. But the real big issue was the banks just weren't lending the money.
Yeah, you're so right. Then the other thing I want to highlight again is if you've done this since the truck in the toolbox conversation, is you don't fight the market, you pivot to what's working, right? And you got out of the high end and then you went to the bread and butter home that, a lot of people could afford. So kudos to you. And again, it's funny when you look at that and you made just as much money on, a product that was probably, I don't know, 1/10, 1/12 of what the other ones were.
Yeah, probably, yeah, somewhere around there. And you don't fight the trend. You never go against the trend. You have to work with the trend. And so you want to counter that with being a contrarian investor. So some people will say, buy when there's blood in the streets. You want to be a contrarian investor, that can work, but it's got to be within the context of the trend.
Yes.
So, that's what you got to think about. So when the market was going up, I was leading it up. And when, like one property would sell for 100,000 a day, I'd sell it for 120 tomorrow, 130. I had a business model back then. If my house was sitting or a property was sitting on the market more than 30 days, I would raise the price and it would sell. Very weird.
Wow.
That was pre 2008 and 9. And, inventory started dwindling, vacant lots, all the builders started building specs. And then it went from, I was the only buyer to where everybody, and then they were getting bid up and things like that. So you lead it up on the way up. But when that thing shifts, you got to look at the momentum of the trend and it rolls over and starts going down the hill. And then you lead the market down, meaning, if it's sold for 100 today, 75 tomorrow, 50, and you just kind of work it like that, because even the appraisers were calling it a declining market. So, and in the markets today, we have a trend that we're in right now. And it's, so you don't fight the trend, you don't fight the Fed, you try to identify the momentum and work with it and then pivot with it. You have to be nimble and you have to pivot.
Yeah. The other thing I want to poke out just a little bit more and see if you see the possibility of the same this time is land, right? Land is one of those things that's kind of, in my experience, the last thing to go up and then it's the first thing to fall, right? Because it's illiquid, doesn't produce cash flow. You still have all the liabilities with land. Do you think land might be one of the first things that fall in this environment?
No, I wouldn't say fall. And it's a very different animal now because builders are trying to build as fast as they can. They're looking for finished lots. So when you say land, there's all kinds of different land out there that you can buy. But let's just talk about, development property. With as little inventory as there is right now, there's a ton of demand for development. So there's a ton of demand for land. Whereas in most markets, land is usually the slowest moving segment because it's, more risky. It's more time consuming. People want, finished product now in single family residential and in commercial and multifamily. It's, it takes a certain individual to be a developer and to bring product to the market. And you have to be ahead of the curve because a lot of times you're bringing new product to the market when there is no demand, but there will be 2, 3, 4 years when you're done. Yeah. So it's a different kind of business model. Whereas right now there's pent up demand everywhere in most markets, especially in the Sun Belt. So there's a lot of competition for land right now. Land's been selling, at record numbers in the right locations. And not all land is created equal. I mean, there's still land that you can't give away, things like that. But the days of the people that I know that became very wealthy with land, I know several people that in their areas in my corridor have been buying land for 60 years. And, they have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of properties, vacant land, because they were buying it for just, stupid money, $100 an acre, $1,000 an acre, just really crazy developable land where, the city limits had moved towards in some of these areas. Those types of opportunities are kind of few and far between now in most areas.
Okay. And then the last thing, because you were a builder, one of the things I've been doing a lot of reading, because I think there will be some builders that got in this kind of adjustment with rates so high. It just seems to me that this might be the hardest time ever to be a developer, right? Because you have supply chain issues, you have dead days, you have nobody you can find. Costs of everything are up from labor to supplies. It's just, am I wrong, or does this feel like one of the hardest environments to be a builder in?
Yeah, it's one of the most, difficult and frustrating from that standpoint, getting stuff in and getting stuff done, and costs, creeping on you. But it's one of the best times from a profitability standpoint, because everybody has in their contracts, force majeure and, these escalation clauses, because you don't know what it's going to cost you at the end of the day. So if you're doing custom work for a client, it's cost plus. And, so that's a great position to be in, because everything's out of your control. Time, penalties, things like that, are kind of out the window, because you just can't control a lot of things right now, due to what's going on in the supply chain. So from that standpoint, it can be good, but from the other standpoint, it's extremely difficult, because your clients don't understand all that. It's frustrating for the client. It's frustrating for the vendors and suppliers and everybody involved in the business. So it is a difficult time, because you can't get enough done and deliver units to the market fast enough. And, I don't know, I think they say that we have a 5-year supply shortage right now, that we couldn't, as a country building at the pace we're building right now, it'll take 5 years at current levels to build through the demand that's out there right now.
Yeah, I guess the last question on topic number one for you, and if you don't know, it's totally okay, but I just wanted to ask, what percentage of stuff that goes into a home, a new construction, is, I don't know, I'll call it manufactured or produced in the US versus has to be shipped or flown in from around the world? Do you have any idea?
I don't know the percentages, but, a lot of the building components and products, cabinets, countertops, all that comes from outside the country. Obviously, lumber generally is produced within the United States, but a lot of the other products, or the components that go into those products, are shipped from overseas.
Yeah.
So it's,
that's not getting any better.
Well, that's pretty much everything. I mean, there's hardly anything produced in this country anymore.
Yeah, we've got to fix that. That's one of the things that I hope comes out of this in the next decade or so. We make a lot more stuff, from pharmaceuticals to PCE or whatever it's called, to building components. I think relying on people that don't like us is not a great recipe for long-term success. What do you think?
Yeah, energy is a big one. Food security is another one. So we need to be the largest producers of energy, food, all the core things that we need, so we don't have to rely on, countries that can use that against you, and especially our enemy countries. We definitely don't want to be relying on them. And just the pandemic alone started the deglobalization process. The war in Ukraine has accelerated it. And, we have friends around the world, but I think all of the larger nations, there's no reason why we can't be the largest exporter to all of these other countries, and eliminate, the ability of the enemies to use all that against us, like we're seeing it happen right now.
Totally agree. Couldn't agree more. Do me a favor. Where can people find you? You put out amazing stuff every day.
Yeah, gregdickerson.com. All my social media links are there. Go check it out.
Thanks, buddy.